Halli Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds, airs Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, and is always available for your listening pleasure at HalliCasser-Jayne.com. And thank you so much for joining me. I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Today on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, we're exploring the question, is anti-Zionism the new anti-Semitism? With a panel of esteemed guests, including Ruthie Blum, Alan Kaufman, Joshua Muravchik, Thane Rosenbaum, Annika Rothstein, and Jonathan Tobin. But first, a brief message from our sponsors. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is always available online at HalliCasser-Jayne.com. Today, the Halli Casser-Jayne Show is brought to you by Audible.com, a leading provider of spoken audio information and entertainment. Listen to audiobooks whenever and wherever you want. If you want to listen to it, Audible has it. With over 150,000 titles in virtually every genre, you'll find what you're looking for. Get a free audiobook and 30-day trial today by signing up at www.audibletrial.com/The Halli Casser-Jayne Show.
Is someone you love living with frequent pain? Are they spending more time just sitting in a chair or lying in bed or going to the ER more often? Other than taking them to the doctor, you may not know what else to do. Treasure Coast Hospice can help in more ways than you may realize. Even if you don't think your loved one is ready for hospice care, their experts can evaluate your loved one's condition and direct you to the right resources in our community. Call Treasure Coast Hospice to learn more or visit tchospice.org.
Alan Kaufman is an American-Israeli author and the son of a Holocaust survivor. His books include the critically acclaimed memoirs Jew Boy and Drunken Angel. David Mamet has called Kaufman's novel Matches, based on Kaufman's experiences as an infantry soldier in the Israel Defense Forces, an extraordinary war novel. He is the editor of the award-winning anthologies The Outlaw Bible of American Poetry, The Outlaw Bible of American Literature, and The Outlaw Bible of American Essay. Kaufman's op-eds and essays have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, Huffington Post, San Francisco Chronicle, Salon, Partisan Review, and the Evergreen Review. He currently writes a blog on Jewish and Israeli affairs for the Times of Israel. I want to welcome to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, Alan Kaufman. Hi, Alan.
Hi, nice to be on the show again.
It's great to have you here. So, Alan, let's assume nothing here. This show is Anti-Zionism the New Anti-Semitism, right? Give me a definition.
Mm-hmm.
What is Zionism?
Well, Zionism is the political and philosophical kind of perspective that allows that, given the circumstances of history's treatment towards the Jews must have a homeland of our own, and that there is full political and ethical justification for the existence of that homeland, and it ought to be a country, a nation-state, with a government and an army of its own and enjoying full self-determination.
Zionism is under attack, even by some Jews. Why is it under attack suddenly, or is it sudden?
Well, I mean, there's a long history of animosity towards Zionism extending all the way to its origins, its beginnings. The idea of the Jew as a helpless kind of participant in society that can be blown about by the winds of circumstances or according to the political needs of the time or whatever mood is upon the ruling class was, a fond image of the Jew, a Jew that could be kicked to the curb anytime one wished. The idea that a Jew would enjoy empowerment within a state of one's own is a relatively new concept in the long history of Jewish persecution. And so, first of all, there was the fact that the world had not really gotten used to this new idea, this new view, if you will, of the Jew. Secondly, the circumstances under which we came about were, due especially to the Holocaust. It was really the Holocaust that woke up the world to the fact that a Jewish homeland was needed. It really was the Holocaust that precipitated the vote in the UN that allowed for that. So, we're talking about still a relatively recent occurrence in human history, in Western civilization. But what's happened, and of course, you had an animosity toward the state of Israel, towards Zionism. It was perceived as nationalism. A lot of people on the left had a lot of problems with people who even were well-meaning. So you had all of that going on, but I would say in the last 10 years, since 9/11, and even before, but especially since 9/11, there has been the appearance of something that is brand new in the degree of exposure. We're seeing now levels of anti-Semitism occurring in the West itself that were probably there all along, but not visible in the way they are now, and not vocally expressed. It's become okay today to say, I hate Israel. It's been okay today to march in parades in the center of major urban centers, screaming, gas the Jews. It's become okay to do that. One will find support and justification for doing that. That's brand new.
I want to bring Ruthie Blum into the conversation. Ruthie is the current affairs columnist for Israel Hayom. Her articles appear in the Jerusalem Post, Algemeiner, and the New York Observer. She's a feature writer for Israel 21C, a web magazine on Israeli innovation. She's the author of To Hell in a Handbasket, Carter, Obama, and the Arab Spring. Ruthie's American-born, but lived in Israel for quite some time. Hi, Ruthie. Nice to have you on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show again.
Hi, Halli. Halli, nice to be here.
So you're an American and you're an Israeli. So talk to me from your Israeli perspective. Israel's under attack in the world, and most recent World Gods, the American press and the European press were relentless in their criticism of Israel. Do you attribute the attacks to anti-Zionism / anti-Semitism, to political ideology, or from your Israeli perspective, is it all of the above, or are any of them any different?
Okay, I would say it's all of the above, and it's joined with the left and radical Islam. I mean, that sounds like a big mouthful, but what I'd like to add to what Alan was saying about the Holocaust. After the Holocaust, when Jews were perceived as weak, downtrodden, half-dead, and the UN voted to allow the Jews to return to Palestine, to the Jewish state, and to create a Jewish state, that was when Jews were dead, were dying and dead and weak. And up until the Six-Day War, even the left cheered the Jews on to that extent. First of all, not the Jews, but Israelis. Israel became like a new Jew. After the victory of the Six-Day War, when even the left in America and in Europe were really cheering on Israel, once Israel occupied the territories that it gained as a result of the victory of the Six-Day War, Israel suddenly turned into the Goliath. Before it was David. It was weak and it was being devoured. And now it was showing power. And once that happened, old anti-Semites who had been in the closet, anti-Semitism was taboo in the West. Once the Holocaust happened, the fact that there were anti-Semites in high-class society, that was no longer permissible. But once the Jews and Israelis were perceived as strong and not weak, Israel became a vehicle for those anti-Semites to be able to supposedly criticize policies of a government and do it in a legitimate way, or supposedly a legitimate way, and it was a way of expressing the underlying anti-Semitism. And how do we know this? We know this because it isn't just conspiracy theory. There's nothing wrong with criticizing policies of a government, but when Israel became the only target of such criticisms in the UN and among nations, then you had to suspect that something was up. And when radical Islam exploded, and you could say that really the beginnings of that were in 1979 with the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, those forces that are anti-Jew and anti-Christian joined forces with the left, and then this anti-Israel ideology sort of just exploded on the scene, and it really is anti-Semitism. Yes.
So, Ruthie, within Israel, there are strong opinions about everything. The left and the right might live in different countries. Talk to me. Is that vocal schism helpful to Israel's global image and to Judaism's global image?
It ought to be. The fact that there's diversity of opinion and the fact that Israel is a vibrant democracy with many different opinions, all of which are expressed in the parliament, the Knesset, should be a source of great pride and all that to people living outside of Israel. But it, too, is used against Israel by those who want to attack Israel, yes, which is really mysterious, actually. You'd think it would be something to praise. In fact, the far left outside of Israel loves to use the Israeli left as examples. You see, those Israelis also say that Israel is a bad country and has bad policies. But the fact that there are differing opinions, I mean, everybody knows 2 Jews and 3 opinions, right? Everybody knows that. So in the state of Israel, of course, you have. And, you know, Jews tend to be liberals, so of course Israelis tend to be liberals. They're Jews.
They're Jews, that's for sure. So,
that's right.
Joshua, if I could just, this is Alan, if I could just add a little bit to what was just said, say that there is a history in Jewish history, you know, contemporary, modern, going back to the 19th century, you know, this kind of divisiveness between Zionism and socialism and Zionism and the left, and even in the Warsaw Ghetto, Jews were arguing in the shadow of death, Zionists and socialists fighting who's going to fight with who and should we join forces or not, even as people were being carted off to the gas chambers. So this divisiveness is very, very deeply rooted in Jewish and Israeli culture. And in Israel, there is a strong anti-Zionist trend among people in the cultural sphere, especially in the arts. You had people who came up from Germany, who came over, immigrants who came to escape from Nazism, but were bitterly anti-Zionist when they got to Israel, and they occupied positions of importance in Israeli culture. And you see some of that flavor still carrying forward into the literature and into the visual arts. So do this under the delusion that doing so is retaining our independence and freedom, but we're not paying attention, as we just heard, to how this is playing into the hands of the world. They are using these things against us, and they're using these things against us to call for our annihilation.
Let me bring Joshua into this conversation. Joshua Muravchik is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of the Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Studies. His most recent book, Making David into Goliath, How the World Turned Against Israel, and a short companion e-book titled Liberal Oasis, The Truth About Israel, was released in 2014. He's the author of 9 previous books, and he's also published more than 400 articles on politics and international affairs, contributing to, among others, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, and the New Republic. Mr. Muravchik is adjunct professor at the Institute for World Politics, and I want to welcome him to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. How are you today? And so nice to have you here.
Oh, I'm fine today, Halli, and it's nice to be with you. Thanks for inviting me on.
Well, I just love this book. And as you say in your book, 40 years ago, Israel was the object of widespread sympathy and admiration. It was hailed especially by progressives and intellectuals such as Dr. Martin Luther King, Pablo Picasso, and then suddenly today, here we are. Israel stands as one of the most criticized and most despised nations. Jimmy Carter, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, former UN chief Kofi Annan, lambast Israel every time Israel acts in self-defense. So what's the deal? Why did all of this change?
Well, Halli, it didn't change suddenly. It changed over a period of years in increments. As Ruthie mentioned, 1967 war was a turning point, but really the change started to get underway more in the 1970s after that moment had passed. And I think there were 2 kinds of forces at work that turned the world around in its attitude toward Israel. And I would say, by the way, turned it around quite dramatically. I can't think of any case anywhere in history where a country that has not undergone a revolution that completely transformed its political nature, where a country has experienced such a total reversal of the way it was viewed and treated by the rest of the world. And I think on the one hand there were material pressures brought to bear by the Arabs. There was a lot of intimidation through Arab terrorism all over Europe and in the skies. There was the further intimidation of the oil embargo, which really brought Europe and Japan to their knees. And there's the sheer weight of numbers. For every Jew in the world, there are 100 Muslims. There's one Israel Israel, 22 member states of the Arab League, 57 member states of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and these control the UN and wield a great deal of economic and diplomatic power. These factors I would lump together as sort of material pressures that were brought to bear to turn people against Israel. But then they were complemented by another kind of force, which was an intellectual change that occurred in the latter half of the 20th century that was not specific to the Middle East. There was a transformation of leftist thought globally, but it had profound consequences for the Middle East. That transformation was what academics would call a change of paradigm. For 100 years, the main paradigm or core idea of leftist thought was class struggle, the poor against the rich, the workers against the capitalists. That gave way in the latter part of the 20th century to a different image of heroic struggle that grew out of the anti-colonial movements. And this was the so-called rest against the West, or the people of color against the white man. And this became seen in leftist thought as the most important and redemptive drama of our era. And if you look at the world through that prism, well, the Israelis are the Western white guys, and the Palestinians and other Arabs are the anti-colonial people of color, and they're the heroes, and the Western white guys are the villains. Those two forces, the intellectual and the material pressures, I think, combined to bring about this enormous change.
Thane Rosenbaum is a novelist, essayist, and law professor, the author of the critically acclaimed novels The Stranger Within Sarah Stein, The Golems of Gotham, Secondhand Smoke, the novel and stories Elijah Visible, and the forthcoming How Sweet It Is. His articles, reviews, and essays appear frequently in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Huffington Post, Haaretz, and The Daily Beast, among other publications. He moderates an annual series of discussions on culture and politics at the 92nd Street Y, called The Talk Show. He's a senior fellow at NYU School of Law, where he directs the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society. His nonfiction books include Payback, The Case for Revenge. So, Thane, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me, Halli.
Sure. We can't have this discussion without taking up the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In a recent op-ed of yours, I love this, in the Wall Street Journal, published during Israel's latest war with Hamas, caused quite a stir. It was titled Hamas Civilians' Death Strategy, and the subread, Gazans shelter terrorists and their weapons in their homes right beside sofas and dirty diapers. Talk to me. What was it you were trying to say?
Well, I'm glad that you said trying to say, because it was amazing how distorted what I wrote actually. Very few people actually read things nowadays. They just walk away with a soundbite. Look, there was a lot of interesting back and forth over the summer. First, the discussion had to do with disproportionate loss. Palestinians were being killed at clearly disproportionate numbers to Israelis. And so that was part of the discussion. But then, of course, the Israelis pointed out that you have Palestinians, family members, women and children who are being used as, in many cases, voluntarily as human shields. And the response to that was, yes, but these are innocent civilians. And I was interested in looking at what does it mean to be an innocent civilian in such an asymmetrical war, as we've learned that Hezbollah and Hamas has taught the world how to fight those wars. The concept of innocent civilians under the Geneva Conventions were very clear. George Washington knew that he couldn't go into a farmhouse, or the Tories couldn't go into a farmhouse and yank out a civilian and hold him hostage and threaten a civilian. What the Geneva Convention hasn't considered is the situation in Gaza, which is where people voluntarily, democratically elect a terrorist organization. Then they allow them to use their own homes as places to store their weapons, allow them to use their homes as places to allow terrorists to serve as command centers, and then voluntarily give up their children willingly as human shields. In a situation like that, I think that all I was trying to say is that there's a great deal more complexity about what does it mean to be an innocent civilian. In a situation like that, you might start to look a little more like a conscripted soldier. The issue can't be simply because if you're not wearing a uniform, you're automatically a non-combatant. Hamas isn't wearing a uniform. Everybody's dressed as a civilian. So we have to ask a much more fundamental question, which is there is a cult of death that exists in the Arab Islamic world. We have to be honest about a cult of death, and that there is a kind of glorification of martyrdom, and that when a society has so little value placed on life and actually fights a war by saying we place no value on our own lives, and we understand that your weakness, your Achilles heel, Israel, is that you do place value on lives, which is why we will trade 1,000 of our prisoners for one of yours. In a situation like that, when you're dealing with such an asymmetrical war, that we have to be much more intellectually honest about not looking at this the way we think about innocent civilians in the Western world, but that, in fact, the question of innocence is a very different question in the asymmetrical conflicts of the Middle East.
So then that gets me to the obvious next question, which is why is that, which seems so clear to some minds, so denied by others. That fact that the moral equivalence of Israel to Hamas, which we know used human shields, post-war, many journalists came out and said so, that they had been intimidated not to say so, and yet the world still, and remember this in the context of what we're talking about, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, holds on to a different reality. Talk to me.
Well, there was another essay I wrote over the summer for the Times of Israel. I think they titled it The Palestinian Pass, and that spoke to a different issue, which is that Palestinians are being held to a very different standard of behavior, which means that the way in which they resist Israel is very much unlike the kinds of what we were much more used to, African Americans in the United States or the Kurds of Kurdistan, that in this instance, the Palestinians, everything is forgiven that's done by Palestinians, and they're not held to account for their conduct. And I think that that's what you've seen throughout the last several months. Israel is held to a very high standard of moral perfection, and nothing is demanded of Palestinians, and everything is forgiven. And the only conclusion that you can draw from that is that can't be that Palestinian lives are so much more precious than Congolese or Mayans or Tibetans or Armenians. They're not. It's just that somehow the loss of Palestinian life, precisely because it's often taken by Jews as persecutors, the world pays attention. When Arabs kill Arabs, nobody cares, even when the numbers are exponential. I mean, not even exponentially higher numbers. 200,000 people in Syria, tens of thousands in Iraq. But if Israelis kill 1,000 people, it gets magnified, and it's in part must have something to do with global anti-Semitism and less to do with the preciousness of Palestinian life.
Love it. Annika Rothstein is a political advisor and writer, a native of Sweden. She writes for various national and international magazines and websites on the topic of Israeli politics, European Jewry, and human rights. Annika, welcome to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. So nice to have you on the panel today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So you live in Sweden, and I have to say, not too long ago, you made quite a headline yourself when you filed for asylum in your own country.
Yes.
What prompted you to take such an unprecedented step? Do tell.
Well, it came about a few years ago. Sweden made international headlines when it said it would open its doors to Syrian refugees. And our political leadership said that this is because Sweden is a haven for human rights and religious rights. And as a person who has fought for the right to be openly Jewish in this country, I found this astounding that they were offering this right to other people, whereas myself and my children and the people I care about cannot practice our religion freely in our country. We cannot even eat the food our religion prescribes. We can't go to our synagogues openly and wear a kippot openly in public. So I felt that our religious rights were being trampled, and I wanted someone to listen, because the political leadership wouldn't listen to me on my own. And I thought that if I make a big splash, a big statement, maybe they would.
This was a year ago, 2 years ago you did this?
This was a year ago.
A year ago?
Yeah.
Up until that time, was there a change that prompted this, or had this been going on in Sweden, and we all didn't know it for quite some time.
It has been going on for quite some time. One of the things that I wrote an article in Mosaic magazine when I decided to file for asylum, and I said that one of the things that upset me is the day-to-day things that are not possible. For example, we have a ban on kosher slaughter. That ban came about in 1937 in this country. So many of the prohibitions that have been going on against Jews have been going on since before the Second World War. The idea of the Jew as the other is something that is a permanent state in this country. It's just that not a lot of people care about Sweden or the Nordic countries, and maybe it doesn't make international headlines, but life as a Jew in this part of the world has always been difficult.
Let me bring Jonathan Tobin in. A little background on Mr. Tobin. Jonathan S. Tobin is the award-winning senior online editor and chief political blogger of Commentary Magazine, America's premier monthly journal of opinion and ideas. He edits and writes for the publication's website, and in that capacity covers the U.S.-Israel relationship and Middle East diplomacy. His work appears regularly in the New York Post, the Weekly Standard, the Christian Science Monitor, the American Spectator, and, of course, many more venues. He lectures, and he appears on CNN, Fox News Channel, the BBC, NPR, Pacifica, and numerous other media. And I want to welcome him to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. So here's something that you recently wrote. You said the reaction to the fighting in Gaza continues to produce symptoms of Europe's age-old disease, anti-Semitism. The latest evidence of this vile behavior not only raises questions about the precarious position of European Jewry, but also gives the lie to the claim that one can be an anti-Zionist without slipping inevitably into Jew hatred. Jonathan, why can't one be an anti-Zionist without slipping inevitably into Jew hatred? Talk to me.
Well, the thing is, we often hear this, with people saying, I like Jews, I don't want to discriminate against Jews, but I just don't like Israel, I don't like the idea of Israel. There's a big problem with that just in principle, because it really doesn't fly. The thing is, Israel is the one Jewish state in the world. The Jewish people have but one state. The idea that you could deny to Jews what you grant to every other people in the world and do so without it being an act of prejudice is illogical. The fact is, when you discriminate against someone, and anti-Zionism is a form of discrimination. You're saying, no, the Jews can't have a home in their own historic homeland. They must live elsewhere. They must be a religious minority wherever they are. They can't have what we give to every other people, every other national group. You're saying something that is inherently discriminatory. So the idea just in principle, even without being mean or saying bad words, that you can be an anti-Zionist and not be an anti-Semite is just illogical, and it doesn't fly. But it goes further than that. The fact is that anti-Zionists are almost always the same people who are bringing up traditional attitudes related to traditional Jew hatred. They are invoking stereotypes. They are playing the entire panoply of traditional anti-Semitic themes in their effort to deny to the Jews that which other peoples don't have denied. Because the point is, it's not a question of whether you agree with Israel's policies or you like its government. I mean, Israel, as we say, it's a democracy. It's run by politicians, just like politicians everywhere. You can like some, not like others, or really not like any of them any of the time. But what is at stake here is not the question of whether Benjamin Netanyahu is a good politician or you like everything he does any more that people in the United States can like everything Barack Obama did, or before him George W. Bush. You could oppose Barack Obama and still love America and never question the right of the United States to exist as a sovereign country. You could do the same for George W. Bush. But somehow disliking the policies of Benjamin Netanyahu leads people into a position where they are saying that, well, really, Israel is not a legitimate player. It's not a legitimate country. That's why anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, because they're just playing that card, and they're doing so almost invariably with the language of hate, with stereotypes, whether they're accusing Jews of buying Congress or manipulating the media, which is a laugh considering how anti-Israel the mainstream media really is. This all plays into the anti-Semitic playbook. And those who call themselves merely anti-Zionists or just thinly veiled anti-Semites invariably.
Palestinian-Israeli problem. I'm going to call it a problem. I guess there are other ways to call it, right? Common trope along the political set is this. It says if the issue of the Palestinian state is resolved, is solved, then it's going to be smooth sailing for Israel and the Jews. What say you, Jonathan Tobin?
Well, there are a couple of problems with that. Number one, the drive to deny the Jews a state in historic Palestine, the land of Israel, as Jews always referred to it, long predated the question of whether the Palestinian Arabs should have a state. After all, the West Bank and Gaza, which is where we're told is Palestinian territory and where a Palestinian state should exist, were an Arab possession from 1949 to 1967. Everybody knows that. There was no drive to have a Palestinian state, and yet there was a consistent drive to destroy the state of Israel, then much smaller than it is today. More to the point, the Palestinians don't really consider that's the issue either, because we now, in journalism, what happened yesterday is ancient history, but the Palestinians have turned down offers of statehood repeatedly. They did it in 2000. In 2001, Mahmoud Abbas, the supposed Palestinian moderate leader, led the negotiating table in 2008 when Ehud Olmert offered him the map that he purports to want and the state that he says he wanted. Indeed, in almost all of the West Bank, a share of Jerusalem as well as Gaza. So it's not a question of what the Palestinians are going to get. The problem is the Palestinians won't recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state alongside a putative Palestinian state, no matter where its borders are drawn or what it's prepared to grant to the Palestinians. And the Palestinians' foreign cheerleaders or sympathizers, again, these people who wish to deny to Israel that which they would wish to give to the Palestinians, they're not really that interested in the question of the Palestinian state. Indeed, the fact that so many people in Europe and elsewhere took to the streets this summer to demonstrate for a quote-unquote free Gaza and to oppose Israel's campaign against Hamas just exposes the hypocrisy of this whole thing. Because after all, what is Hamas against? Hamas says it's resisting the occupation, but by the occupation they're not referring to Jewish settlements in the West Bank or where the border between a Palestinian state and Israel should be. By occupation they mean the presence of Jews in any part of the country. Tel Aviv is as much a settlement to them as any place in the West Bank, and their charter, their platform is the destruction of the Jewish state, the expulsion of its Jewish population. So people were demonstrating on behalf of, in sympathy with a group that is openly calling for a genocide of the Jewish people. So this whole question of, is about the Palestinian state, it's about whether Israel is being sufficiently nice to the Palestinians, is absurd because that's not the focus of what these demonstrations are doing. It's not the focus of Palestinian quote-unquote resistance to Israel.
Josh, I'm going to use you for a second as a historian. Can you go there with me on this? And that is, I want to explain where this really comes from and going back to the Grand Mufti and the Nazis. Could you give us a little background very quickly on that?
Well, the Arabs furiously resisted the Jewish presence that began to build up in the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century in Palestine, and the leader of the Arabs in Palestine came to be the Grand Mufti. He also had a variety of other titles, but Haj Amin al-Husseini, who spent a large part of World War II in Berlin making propaganda broadcasts in Arabic for Hitler, and also trying to round up European Muslims for a special unit of the SS. I think to tie this to something we were speaking of earlier, in the early days of Israel, one of the things that shielded Israel to some extent in world opinion was that the Arabs had this hangover of having been on the wrong side in World War II, which a lot of people disliked. They were allied with the Axis. And in those next decades, the Arab states used a lot of Nazi escaped functionaries to do their propaganda, and so it had a kind of a tinge to it that was repugnant to Western ears. In the late 1960s, the rise of Yasser Arafat was part of a maneuver in which the Arab and Palestinian cause switched from being allied with the far right to being allied with the communist liberationist left, and that gave it a much more appeal, not only to communists, but to the whole dominant intellectual class of Europe and the United States to some extent.
Okay, I think that was important to get that in there. Alan, I want to ask you, are Jews their own worst enemy? I want to talk to you about that in this respect. There are an awful lot of Jews who are quick to put down Israel in every sense. And what are your thoughts about those Jews? And I want you to address the term which is thrown around social media like no other called self-hating Jews. Does it really exist? And let's put that also within the context of a group like, let's say, J Street. Talk to me.
Well, I wrote an article in, of all places, Haaretz, in which I basically contended that American Jews view Israeli Jews as the other. And, if one looks at the trajectory of a Jewish life starting in Europe, experienced the Holocaust, coming out of the Holocaust, interning in a camp in Cyprus, and then from Cyprus moving to Israel, being illegally smuggled into Israel, and then fighting, war after war. Clearly, that sort of narrative differs a great deal from the kind of narrative that American Jewry experienced, the kind of experience that American Jews had. Not to say that American Jews, that it was a day at the beach, but by and large, a majority of American Jews did not experience the Holocaust. In fact, demonstrated a real kind of antipathy to the Holocaust. There really wasn't a great deal of vocal protest mounted against it. There was a consistent kind of protest, but not really what you would have imagined possible. And then after World War II, when American Jewry became kind of ascendant in the political, first in the literary and then in the political arena, again, this new embrace of American power, but it really, it produced things like a Kissinger. It didn't produce any great, leadership that was, decisively, embracing Israel. There was fondness to Israel, there was, care for Israel and so forth, but there really was no understanding of Israel. And I think that is something that people had hoped Netanyahu would somehow bridge that gap, Netanyahu having American kind of roots, orientation, had really hoped that Netanyahu would somehow be a bridge, but of course he's not. I mean, Netanyahu is, decidedly Israeli, in every respect. He's not American. So I think that's one reason. Even when I read, Peter Bernard, to people like that, talking about what they consider Zionism to be, they can simply consider Zionism to be, the right to constantly criticize Israel, the right to hold Israel in the wrong no matter what. But I agree with Israel's existence. I'm going to embrace policies that will certainly lead to Israel's destruction. But I love Israel. I mean, that's basically the J Street perspective, because if you look closely at what they argue for, and, I'll begin with the idea of a Palestinian state in the West Bank. Do they mention the fact that, in both the West Bank and Gaza, you now have a highly radicalized population. Abbas does not represent the Palestinian people. Abbas, I don't know what he represents. The fact of the matter is you have a highly radicalized population there who, as we just heard before, don't agree with the existence of the State of Israel and consider their agenda to be to have the entirety of what is now Israel to be their own, to be their Palestine. So, you have, when I say self-hating, it's not that they hate themselves so much, is that they have no idea what Israel is. They have no idea what's going on there. They have no idea even why Israel exists. I mean, how would you understand why Israel exists living in Dearborn, Michigan? How would you understand why Israel exists living in Chicago? I do know that Jews who have gone to Israel come away with a much different picture than the ones who have never gone. But, actually a very small percentage of American Jews have actually gone to Israel. And that number is actually dropping.
Okay.
So,
let me move on.
Can I jump in here? I think we have to understand that there are two different and not necessarily competing, but actually complementary trends that are driving a lot of the anti-Israel opinion within American Jewry, certainly. One is certainly the sort of leftist, liberal idealist who, if Israel is not perfect, feels empowered to attack it because it is not living up to his or her ideals. This is a long-playing theme on the left. It is being really substantially aided, though, by something that is slightly different, and that has to do with trends that really go beyond anything that's happening in the Middle East or in Israel, and that has to do with the assimilation of American Jewry into the broader American population and the loss of a sense of Jewish peoplehood among huge numbers of American Jews, broad swathes, especially among non-Orthodox Jewry. That was illustrated in the results of a Pew survey of American Jews that came out at the end of last year, which showed that all of the indices of a sense of Jewish identity, of which Israel is an important one, were really down in favor of very amorphous, very loose ideas about Jewish food and Jewish humor. And so it's very difficult to generate strong support for Israel among Jews who don't consider themselves particularly Jewish. They're not necessarily ashamed of being Jewish the way some previous generations were, but they also don't feel any sense of identity or any sense of common shared fate with the Jews of Israel and view their struggles. And even this summer, as Jews in Israel sheltered from rockets in bomb shelters on a daily basis and faced the threat of terrorists coming through tunnels, American Jews, many American Jews, if not the bulk of them, were just kind of watching it on TV and didn't feel any sense that this had anything to do with them. And with those people, it's not so much ideological as it's just a question of assimilation.
That's a scary thought, too.
Can I just point out that some of the first casualties in the recent conflict were actually American Jews and actually French Jews who had volunteered to serve in the Israel Defense Forces, and not people necessarily who had some very Zionist orientation in their upbringing or much Jewish upbringing at all. So I think that that's sort of true, what was said, but I think also that the circumstances, the conditions that have prevailed, say, on academic settings and university campuses of the last 10 years have planted the seeds of a new awareness among young Jews who see their own classmates saying, terrible things about Jews and terrible things about Israel in the matter of a classroom, the course of a classroom discussion, that minds are beginning to change and they're beginning to draw closer and to wonder what does it mean to be a Jew and what does Israel mean to me? I think that's happening. So
okay, hold on a second, Alan. We're going to go back to school in a second. Just hang in there with me because I want to get a couple of things under the belt here. Thane, this is for you. I want to ask you about this in terms of, we were just talking about Jews shooting themselves in the foot in a way. Yesterday, Israel said, knowing it would garner the ire of the world, the press and the UN, said it was going to plan to appropriate about 1,000 acres of land in the West Bank, close to the spot where 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped in June. I'm playing devil's advocate. Is this helpful? Does it fuel the anger, the hostility, the anti-Zionism, the anti-Semitism? What do we do with that? Israel certainly is a sovereign nation and has the right to protect itself. You can understand why they are doing it to some degree. Talk to me about that.
Well, there's two schools of thought on this, which is that the world will hate Israel no matter what it does. So therefore, it might as well do whatever is in its national best interest. That's one school of thought. There is another school of thought, one that I've written about for years. I just think the settlement policy has been a moral blight on the Jewish people worldwide. Would have felt we would always have been, world Jewry would have always been in a better position even if the Israelis had simply occupied or just taken the West Bank as purely disputed land, but not allowed it to be settled. And so clearly, these incidences of where Israel appears to be land grabbing rather than being there making decisions purely for national security reasons compromise the world opinion. It makes it harder to make the case for Israel when its own conduct appears to be intransigent or complicit in fueling a kind of perception of Israel as not and one that is not sympathetic. So obviously, it's not, the optics on that are terrible. But the Israelis have their own political agenda. This is the thing that would add to what Alan said earlier. It's not just that people who have not been to Israel have this perspective. There's also a kind of moral arrogance, a kind of narcissism that people that live in Roslyn, New York. I'm sorry, I'm just laughing. I have nothing against Roslyn, New York. It's a fine community, but the fact that they should have any opinion that should matter to an Israeli who served 3 years in the military, who lives with sirens and rockets being fired at their country. There's a kind of arrogance. It's actually the arrogance of President Obama, by the way, who really, as a community organizer, didn't have much experience in anything, and it's clear he doesn't have much respect for people that wear uniforms. And this is really what Netanyahu had said to him. He says, never second guess me again. And I think the reason he said it with such an edge is essentially saying, are you kidding me? Are you really kidding me?
Right.
What do you know? What do you know about protecting a country? You can't even protect the United States. And I am not going to let you second guess me again, because ultimately the lives of Israelis are under my watch. And I think this is the real moral dilemma, that the Israelis, are playing, two hands of cards, one for the world's perception and the other for their own survival. And they oftentimes have to mediate those differences. What do the optics look like versus what do we ultimately need to do? And we could care less what the rest of the world thinks.
Ruthie, you wrote a book, The Hell in a Handbasket, Carter, Obama, and the Arab Spring. Let's talk about President Obama.
Yes.
An anti-Semite, an anti-Zionist, ignorant, naive, needs to go back to school and study foreign policy, or needs to go back to school to learn how to get along with others. Have his policies added to Israel's unpopular position in the world and compounded the issue of anti-Semitism? And what's your take?
Okay, well, I think calling Obama an anti-Semite sort of, let's say, it doesn't do justice to what Obama actually is. I think that he's not a classical anti-Semite. What he really is a communist and a Muslim Brotherhood supporter. As a result, he's naturally anti-Israel. But before he's anti-Israel, he's also anti-America. What Obama is and has been, very much like Jimmy Carter, actually, but even worse, and that is that he has been somebody who, his mentor was Saul Alinsky, and his plan to undermine America by infiltrating its institutions was a plan, and he's been really carrying it out very, very successfully. In addition, as we've seen throughout his presidency, he has taken the side of the Muslim Brotherhood in almost any conflict, anywhere. It's not just that he has Muslim Brotherhood representatives come to the White House and things like that. It's not only that. It's that in any conflict in the Middle East, he's been on the wrong side. So obviously, Israel fits very nicely into that, his whole anti-Western, pro-third world, pro-Muslim Brotherhood kind of mind frame. So that's number one. Number two, you asked whether his behavior increases anti-Semitism in the world. I think what I'd like to make clear is that you don't need anything to increase anti-Semitism. The anti-Semites who've been around all along, since before World War II, have been there, but they went into the closet. They just came back out of the closet, and the legitimacy to do so was that they were no longer saying nasty, horrible things about people who were being marched into Nazi ovens. Now they have legitimacy. Israel has an army. It fights and wins wars, and it's the startup nation, and it's the only country that didn't fall apart with the global economic crash. Now Israel goes back to being this tough banker, and it's legitimate to go after it, and indirectly or directly go after all the Jews. What Obama enabled was not so much the anti-Semites. What Obama enabled emboldened the Islamists and the radical Islamists, and we can see that, with the Foley beheading, and now the other one with it is, even in the face of that, the best Obama can do is to say, I don't really have a policy on that yet. And then, to make matters worse, if he merely didn't have a policy, that would be bad enough. But what did he do? He joined forces with, of all countries, with Iran to take care of ISIS. So what he does is embolden the forces that are out there that openly say they want to wipe Israel off the map. And they mean it. And by the way, when you said before about appropriating land in Judea and Samaria and how that looks in the world, well, maybe that looks bad, but the world already said that in any peace agreement that Israel supposedly makes with the Palestinians, if they ever want peace, that is, but in any peace deal, that particular part of land was going to be within Israel's borders anyway. So it's a totally false attack. And just to add to that, I just want to tell you, I'll tell you quickly because I know you're running out of time. Right at the beginning of the war with Gaza, the war in Gaza, in the beginning of July, Haaretz, the very left-wing newspaper in Israel, threw a peace conference. Now, it had been in the works for months before the war broke out. And, ironically, they weren't sure that they could hold the conference because on the first and second days of the conference, rockets were flying over Tel Aviv, and there were sirens and all this. But the best and the brightest of the Israeli left appeared at this conference. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, the media and all the cream of the crop of the literati were at this conference at a hotel in Tel Aviv. And on the stage, among many, many other speakers, one panel had Peter Beinart and Jeremy Ben-Ami, the head of J Street. When both of those, each of them finished speaking, they got standing ovations by an Israeli audience. So when we're talking about whether American Jews really get Israelis or they don't get Israelis, here I would like to say that I don't think the divide is between American Jews and Israelis, but rather between the left and the sane right that believes in genuine human rights and not the distortion of them. Okay, so I'm done with my monologue.
You did well. You said what you needed to say. Jonathan, I want to go back to you, and I want to talk about Minister Netanyahu, who I want to ask you, in your opinion, how well he's handled the missiles being lobbed at Israel, not only by Hamas and Abu Mazen, but by those being shot by the Obama administration. How do you think he's doing?
I think he's done as well as could be expected. He has had a difficult road to hoe with Israel's, prime relationship, its most important alliance. There's nothing that compares to it. Any Israeli prime minister, his most important brief is really handling the United States as well as handling what's going on at home. And he was, he came into office, a month or two after Barack Obama was inaugurated, and Obama has been picking fights with him consistently, with the exception of a one-year Jewish charm offensive when the president was running for re-election. And he has mixed. He's at times he's held his fire, which is the right thing to do. At times he's snapped back when he needed to show the administration that Israel could not be pushed into doing things that were against its interests or against its security. So he's had a very difficult task because the United States is always pushing, number one, to restrain Israel from defending itself. It's always trying to push it to make more concessions to a Palestinian negotiating partner that does not want to make peace. It's a very difficult and delicate dance. Now, I think on the whole he's done fairly well. And that's in spite of the fact that he's a very prickly customer. Certainly he and President Obama don't like each other, although I think even the most charming of Israelis would have a very tough time with dealing with this president. So you can't really fault him. And, let me just go back to one thing. I mean, in terms of how Israel presents itself to the world, Thane mentioned that Israel's policy of settlement, not just what's going on right now, but dating back to the aftermath of the Six-Day War, that presents a bad view of Israel to the world. I think often Israel's problem is that it, certainly from its Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it does not attempt to argue of right against right. The Israelis tend to talk about, well, we have to protect our security, but the Palestinians speak of rights. That it's their land, that they have a right to be there. The Israelis don't have a right to be there. When in fact, Israel has a very good legal case for a share of the West Bank, indeed for a share, for its own right to be where it is. So unfortunately, the Israelis have always pulled their punches on that. They're a little bit shamefaced when, in fact, the more that they concede, the irony of the post-Oslo period of 20 years of peace processing is that the more Israel tries to concede, the more Israel gives up, the less legitimate it is viewed by a world which sees Israel as a thief being forced to return stolen property, when that is not the case.
Oh, fair point. I think I'm going to inject myself here. I think my argument on what they just did Sunday is there was some wild no man's land out there that was very dangerous for young boys, obviously 3 killed. Is that not a reason to say, wait a second, we've got to bring some laws in here? That would just be
I think that if we're talking about what just happened in the land that was appropriated in Kfar and the Gush Etzion block. Right. A little history lesson, which I wrote about this week, in that Gush Etzion is not, yes, it's part of the West Bank, but it was actually Jewish-owned land prior to 1948. It was a block of Jewish settlements, kibbutzim, that were overrun by the Arab Legion and by local Palestinian Arabs in the course of a massacre and the expulsion of the Jews. Of all places for the Jews to have a right, they have a right to be there. And for the United States or for anyone else to claim that this is a case of Jewish imperialism, of playing the colonists, is more absurd when it comes to that than anything else. And yes, it's true that that's where the 3 kidnapped boys were killed. But I think when it comes to that particular piece of land, Israel has a very strong case, regardless of anything else.
Okay, thanks for injecting that. That's a little history that was good for everybody to get to understand and to know. Josh, I want to talk about the UN. You said that the non-aligned movement reshaped the United Nations to become anti-American, anti-Western, and certainly anti-Israel. I'd appreciate if you would elaborate a little bit on that.
In the U.S. Security Council, the U.S. exercises a veto, so it's different than all the other UN bodies. But all the other UN bodies, and there are many, are majority rule. Now, there are 193 members of the UN, and of them, 120 belong to something called the non-aligned movement, which is basically the club or caucus of third world states. And within that group, 57 are part of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So it dominates the non-aligned movement with the 22 Arab states at its heart. So really by this series of steps, the Arabs have complete control over the UN, and they've used it ruthlessly as a battering ram against Israel. They've done 2 things. One is that an amazing disproportionate share of resolutions that come out of the UN on all subjects are devoted to the one subject of lacerating Israel. And then in addition, they've set up no fewer than 3 permanent special UN bodies, one of them a bureau with a huge tens of millions of dollars annually budget, that are devoted entirely to the denunciation of Israel and the promotion of the Palestinian cause. Needless to say that what comes out of these bodies, and as well as of the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, could not be any more one-sided. It's simply scripted to the narrative of the Palestinians and the Israel haters.
And does Israel have a choice? Must they stay? They can't leave? I mean, it's really being cornered.
Well, they can barely stay. The UN operates officially by regional caucuses. East Europe, West Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America. Israel is the only member of the UN that's actually excluded from all regional caucuses, except for a partial membership in the Western Caucus.
Bizarre. Utterly bizarre. BDS and divestiture, the Presbyterian Church, political, moral, rooted in anti-Semitism. Alan, you want to take that one for me? Not the phone, the question.
Sure. I mean, I actually went up in the early days of that. I went up against a panel of divestors, and, I found again that the majority of people in the audience had absolutely no idea what was going on. That it was in the hands of a few skilled organizers who were able to rally that kind of support. I found the level of discussion that took place at the event, between the audience and the panelists and myself, was of a very, very low order. It really had nothing to do with Israel. They had no idea really what Israel was, no idea what was on the table, but there were organizers there who were very skilled professionals who were able to engineer this outcome. So that if you ask me, do I think a majority of them, believe in this divestment? Probably not. They probably don't even know what it actually entails. And so it is with a lot of these movements, these rallies, these organizations, these organizers. They're very skillfully using popular fears, and they're using popular sentiment to kind of engineer these outcomes. And I just wanted to say that, this whole matter of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, what I see as happening is that anti-Zionism was yet one more stake towards a larger outcome. And that larger outcome is manifesting, and I believe that's why we're all here talking. And that is that anti-Semitism was seen as a portal of opportunity to enlarge the scope of hatred, not just against Israel, but against all Jews. I mean, in France, I wrote an article recently in our blog in Times of Israel. There was the head of a French Jewish political group, CRIF, C-R-I-F, who said, in the rallies in Paris, they're not shouting death to Israel. They're shouting death to the Jews. He was astonished by this new kind of development. In Berlin, in San Francisco, at these rallies, they're not shouting death to Israel. They're shouting gas the Jews. In other words, anti-Zionism has been seen now as a platform to a much, much larger issue. And I think the question on the table is, what is going to happen? What are we going to do about that? In other words, Israel knows what Israel is going to do about Israel. But what is world Jewry going to do about this other issue, this larger issue? Israel has become the springboard to it, but now it's out of the bag. It's out of the Pandora's box, and now we're seeing that it is global, and we're seeing that it spans not only Islamic fundamentalists, but it spans the entirety of Europe, and I have. Just to say personally, I have family that was in Caracas, Venezuela, and family that is currently in Paris. They were French Jews, and some went to Caracas after the war because they couldn't bear being in Europe anymore after their experience of the Holocaust. Well, they had to leave Caracas because of Chavez. They're all now in Miami, and my relatives in Paris are living in a condition of terror. They can't wear any religious ornaments. They can't even allow others to know that they're Jewish. They do their best now, as in the Holocaust, to pretend that they're not Jews. They're hidden Jews. They're hiding in plain sight. This is what's happening globally. It's not just happening against Israel, although Israel certainly is the focus in international bodies like the UN and so forth. But what we're seeing is that the phenomena is global. And what I'm not hearing here in this discussion, what I think we need to talk about is, what are we going to do about that?
Well, I think we're going to get to that in a second. Annika, you are in Europe, so let's ask you. You've got young children. How are you feeling these days?
I do. Well, I agree with the previous statement. What's happening now is that European Jewry is faced with a choice of flight or assimilation. And that's where we're at because, the walls are closing in on us on all sides. We have the extreme left. We have Muslim extremists. We have a nice thing is to call it complacency of the regular folk, the political establishment. If they haven't reacted thus far, I don't see them reacting now. As Jews are being hunted down and beaten in the streets, my own prime minister has yet to make an official statement, and this scares me. And I think it's all too easy. It happened sort of seamlessly. I saw it over the summer. I spent most of the summer in Israel, and my friends kept telling me, my Jewish friends kept telling me, just don't come back. Just stay there. Do what you have to do to stay there, because it's gotten so much worse just over the past month. And it happened seamlessly. It was a perfect excuse. I don't see that this war is the catalyst, really. It's a really, really good excuse to hunt Jews and to make Europe Judenfrei again. And, yeah, that's how I see it. If you want to be an open Jew, if you want to live as a Jew and not hide, then you have to leave.
Jewry takes what percentage of the world population? I looked it up and I got a very many different numbers, but I want to throw this out before we get into what can be done about that, and that is maybe to help make the case about how serious the situation we have, that the world is falling apart at the seams. I think all of us understand just how scary what's going on in the Middle East with ISIS and with Syria and you name it, right? It's going on. In Africa, there are problems. And yet, what is the focus of the world? This tiny little nation, what is the size of Rhode Island, and the Jews who are like 1 gazillionth of 1% of the world population. Does that not say something of the obsession of the world? Somebody, Jonathan, you want to take that?
Well, I think somebody once did a cartoon which attempted to show the map of the world based not on geographic size of countries, but in terms of media interests, and that turned out Israel becomes Canada, and much larger countries are the size of Israel. So obviously, and what does this stem from? Well, for well over 1,000 years, the Jews have been the boogeymen of Western civilization. The Western world has been obsessed with Jews, and now the Muslim world is similarly obsessed with Jews because of the offense that they take about the existence of a Jewish country in a part of the world which they consider a Muslim fiefdom. So there's this, Jews are news thing. Those of us within the media know that, what bleeds leads, and the Jews are always going to be a source of disproportionate interest for much of the world. And this goes back to what we were talking about, the lack of a real distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, because this is based on the idea that the Jews are the other, that the Jews are somehow whatever they do is not only more interesting, which maybe somehow it plays out sometimes in the American media, but that it is more sinister, and that it is more upsetting, and that it should not be tolerated. Josh mentioned the idea of, well, when Muslims kill Muslims, nobody cares. Indeed, how many tens of thousands of Muslims have been killed by other Muslims? I mean, hundreds of thousands, perhaps, in Pakistan, in Iraq, and in Syria, and certainly in recent times. But 2,000 Palestinians who were killed in the course of Israel fighting a war to suppress rocket fire from Gaza and terror tunnels is considered an intolerable offense to mankind. This just goes back to this basic principle that Israel is not considered to have a right to exist. It's not considered to have a right of self-defense that any other country would be conceded. So that's at the heart of this entire discussion. The Jews are viewed differently. They're viewed in a discriminatory fashion, and that those who claim to make a distinction between their quote-unquote criticism of Israel and pure anti-Semitism are giving the lie to themselves because of the way they approach this issue. They don't care about human rights problems in much of the world. They care about the perception that Jews are somehow giving offense to Palestinians and to Arabs. And that is, in practice, anti-Semitism. And that's what has to be pushed back again. Not that Israel is perfect, not that Israel never does anything wrong, although it is certainly more rights than wrong, certainly in this conflict, but that the attention given it is a function of anti-Semitic traditional Jew hatred, no matter how it's couched.
Quite right. And I just want to add to that what Raul Hilberg, the author of The Destruction of European Jewry, probably the most important work on the Holocaust ever written, said, that in effect what the Nazi policies towards Jews in Europe, starting in 1933, the Nuremberg laws and so forth in 36 or 37, what those were in effect were a kind of divestment. They, by slow degrees, divested Jews little by little of rights to marry, rights to work, rights to live in certain places, and then finally, ultimately, they divested Jews of the right to live. So when I hear the word divestment, that's what I think of. When I hear the word divestment, divesting Israel of the right to do A, B, C, D, or E is really a step towards divesting Israel and ultimately Jewry everywhere of the right to exist. And I think that's what's on the table. I think what we're seeing is a large, global, slow, but gradually mounting, to tsunami proportions of a movement to divest Israel and Jewry of the right to exist in this world. And, that is what has to be met. And the question is, Hal.
Okay, before we get to how, I have two things that we have to do here. And one is this, that one of the things when we posted this today on Facebook, one of the comments was, here we go, anti-Zionism, just another excuse for the Jews not to have to answer for the atrocities they've done to the Palestinians. You know, fight the argument with the argument. We know that. What do y'all say to that? Thane?
Well, I mean, again, there is the moral hypocrisy of human rights violations taking place all over the world, where no one challenges these matters at all. And the question is why? Why is the obsession? Why is the focus only here? You know, all of these efforts to sort of to turn the argument around, this is, the Holocaust is an excuse for Israel to be able to mistreat the Palestinians. They've learned the lessons of the Nazis. We know the Holocaust was, 60 some odd years ago, and yet, when you think about Germany, how did Germany get away with being a country that no one even thinks about anymore as having, they have like almost an unblemished past? Jews, nothing is forgiven that Jews are do, and yet Germany, throughout all of Europe, when you think about the tens of millions of people that were killed throughout the 1939 to 1945, and nobody raises this at all. You don't hear people say, the same woman who left that comment on your Facebook, or man who left that comment on your Facebook page, wouldn't say the same thing about the Germans. Oh, the Germans, anything to sort of ignore the blemishes of what they've caused during the Holocaust. It's only with respect to Jews that there is so little sense of mutual caring and connection, so little sense of national respect. Everything is dismissed. Everything that's done is very casual. All terrorist attacks against Israel, very casually discussed, if mentioned at all. The media rarely refers to Hamas as a terrorist group. They're referred to as militant.
Really? Don't you love that? Oh my gosh.
It almost only, and you think, how's that possible? I mean, talk about good PR that, an organization, a terrorist organization with a vowed purpose to eliminate all Jews around the world, which is the very definition of terrorism, is considered militants. And everything they're doing is in the spirit of resistance. And yet everything that Israel does in the spirit of its own defense is seen as, another excuse for Israelis to mistreat Palestinians.
I think before we get into solving this, the one thing is, I think everybody on the panel is Jewish. Has anybody ever said to you, I'm an anti-Semite? I know I'm an anti-Semite.
Does email count? Twitter? Because in that case, every day.
Okay, because I will tell you that one of my staff members is German, and her mom was alive at the time of the Holocaust, and she says to me, there's nobody in this country, not a person, who would say, I was a Nazi and I agreed. It was them. I want to put that in the context of how we come to a solution to this really scary, maybe insolvable, new nuance to all of this. And I thought that should be made clear before we even get into the solution, which is a word I don't even like to use anymore because of the final solution. But that being said, Annika, it's a virus. It's an incurable virus, this anti-Semitism, and it's a cancer, maybe. Maybe it retreats into remission, but not for long because it mutates. And here's our latest mutation, and I think you all agree with me on this anti-Zionism. What do you think we can do to stem the tide?
Okay, please.
Annika, you there?
Yes, I'm there. I have a very bleak outlook right now. I would say I had actually an answer to the previous thing you said, because I'm increasingly tired of how that argument is always being made that this is another excuse, that we are put in a very defensive position. I usually say that as a Jew, I was not born with a limited amount of anti-Semite cards that I pull out. If you're very worried about being called an anti-Semite, chances are you are one. And I have the right to call you out on your anti-Semitic actions, the way that you have this disproportionate interest and the Jewish state, and how you say that you really love Jews, you just hate that state with all the Jews in it, that we need a backbone, that world Jewry needs a backbone. I guess that's where I'm coming from right now, that we need to see, first of all, we need to talk about human rights, because that seems to be a word that's used against us a whole lot. But religious rights are human rights. We have a right to live. That's what my asylum application was all about, the fact that they are using these very sly methods. Once again, they are trying to take away our rights one at a time, our right to kosher meat, our right to circumcision, and soon, like someone said on the panel here, our right to marry or to live. And we have to fight that with every means possible, and to use the issue of human rights, and to grow a backbone, honestly, and not be put on the defensive constantly, because I'm tired of it. When the country that I call my own defends itself from missiles, I don't think that I should have to go on debate and pretend or defend what to me is obvious. So maybe that's part of the solution, to grow a backbone and to use our voices.
Halli, this is Josh. Can I interject something that's a little bit contrapuntal? I think that in America there's a very different situation. The American people are overwhelmingly friendly to Israel and overwhelmingly friendly to Jews. There's an amazing recent Pew survey in which Americans were given a list of 10 different religious groups, almost everyone you could think of, and asked how they felt about them. And the group that came out with what they called the warmest response was Jews. I think that this is in stark contrast to what's going on in Europe and elsewhere. But I think that in the U.S. we have not a problem of anti-Semitism, but we have a political problem in which the left, or as it's called in the U.S., the liberals, are getting more and more anti-Israel, including Jewish liberals, and we have at this moment a president and a secretary of state who are more tied to the left, and even the pretty extreme left, than we've ever had in U.S. history. And the biggest single step that could be taken to improve the scene from this side of the Atlantic would be to elect a very different president in 2 years.
Yeah. Thane, your thoughts?
I don't know. I mean, the last 2 months have been so discouraging on every level. It was very hard to watch. It was harder to write about it. There was a whole new phenomenon on Facebook, as you may have heard, where people finally had to defriend friends because of, all of a sudden people were being much more honest in articulating a kind of anti-Semitism framed in the context of this Gazan conflict, and many Jews weren't buying it. They saw something else at work, that there was just a Jew hatred that was masking itself as, something that became all of a sudden acceptable. A number of our panel, just people on your program today, pointed out, the kinds of rhetoric that people got away with in the last 2 months was really frightening. Hamas, Jews to the gas. This became very casually invoked. And imagine if anyone said anything like that in the context of African Americans here in the United States, used casually invoking the word lynching. And so it's very discouraging. It's not just that European Jews and, Venezuelan Jews need to leave. And we now know what's the number? 1,000 Jews, French Jews, are now reported to be going to Israel this year. 1,000. So I don't know. There's no good takeaway here. There really isn't. Which is why I said earlier, in the end, Israel has to do what it has to do, and it can't do it merely thinking about whether it's going to satisfy people who live in other parts of the world that have never faced these kinds of existential dilemmas. But I do think that one thing that did come out of this, as discouraging as it was a true sort of emotional, intellectual honesty. People came out and told you how they really felt. And for global Jewry, so few years after the Holocaust, this is not a good message.
Absolutely. Ruthie?
Yeah, well, I would like to say something about the question of what we can do in terms of the Palestinian issue and anti-Semitism. And that really, the answer is sadly nothing. We cannot cause others to look at us in one way or another. And I think that was proven in the Holocaust. It doesn't matter whether we assimilate. It doesn't matter whether we have the right political views. Nor does it matter if we make peace gestures, we meaning Israel in this case, not just the Jews. Any leader, and now I'll talk about the Arab leaders, has ever had to do with Israel is say, okay, I don't want to wipe you off the map, and we immediately give him land, sign a peace treaty with him. That's the answer. There is absolutely nothing we can do. I mean, we have to keep sharpening our weapons to defend ourselves, but that we can't solve anti-Semitism because nor can we solve the Arab world's hatred of us. We are victims of a hatred that is based on what and who we are, not on what we do or don't do. And therefore, there is nothing we can do or not do. And the only thing Israel can do as a state is do what any state has to do, and that is keep itself, worry about its best interests, have elections, hope the country, that the majority of the population has the country's best interests at heart, vote accordingly, fight wars when they're necessary, and try to survive. That's all we can do.
Jonathan?
Yeah, well, I think Ruthie summed it up very nicely. There are a number of, we've touched on so many issues. Certainly from the point of view, what are the Jews to do? The Jewish left and those who claim to be Israel's friends but want to pressure it and save it from itself keep telling us the current situation is unsustainable, it's creating more anti-Semitism. These are both wrong. The only thing that creates anti-Semitism is anti-Semites, whether they're Arabs, whether they're Europeans. It's about them. It's not about what the Jews do, and it never has been. They hate the Jews when they're rich. They hate the Jews when they're poor. They hate the Jews for assimilating. They hate the Jews for standing apart. They hate the Jews now for having their own country, and that isn't going to change. As far as anti-Zionism from the point of view of the Muslim and Arab world, that's exactly right. A long time ago, Zev Jabotinsky said that the only thing that the Jews could do was to wait for the Arabs to realize that they could not destroy Israel, to hide behind, to shelter behind an iron wall, and wait for them to change their mind. That's still true, but it's very upsetting, and it goes against the grain, certainly here in the United States, where we think we can always cut a deal and compromise, to think that there is no solution. But Ruthie's right. There is no solution to it except to survive. And Jews have to, as Annika said, grow a background. They have to have the courage to speak up and to have confidence, as Josh said, that they are speaking up in a country where the majority of people, not necessarily the majority of Jews at times, are very sympathetic to Zionism in Israel, very unsympathetic to those forces trying to destroy it, and to take confidence from that and not to worry about the good opinion of a world. I mean, one of the healthy signs of life in Israel was that there seemed to be, during the course of the summer and the war, an understanding that the good opinion of the world was worthless. If the world didn't care about the Jews having to suffer attacks and to defend themselves and thinking that they couldn't defend themselves. This has to end, and it has to be merely resisted. Anti-Semitism is a virus, as you said. That was the great formulation of Ruth Weiss. It was the most, when she said it's the most successful ideology of the 20th century. It's becoming the most successful ideology of the 21st century too. But the answer to it is not to compromise. It is not to seek solutions. It is to survive.
Alan, we began with you. Let's conclude with you.
Okay. I don't agree that there's nothing we can do. I think that we have to be proactive. I agree that there's nothing we can do about anti-Semites, and we mustn't waste a single breath on trying to dissuade them or change their view. I completely agree with that. However, when we say Zionism, I have to chuckle, because who do we mean? Who are we talking about? Where is the Zionist movement in the United States? Peter Bernard and J Street apart, which is ridiculous. Where is there an actual Zionist movement in the United States? How does Zionism and Jewish youth in the universities intersect today? I venture to guess that not a single one of them would know who Jabotinsky is, as was just mentioned. So I believe that what can be done and what must be done is that we have to begin to present a new vision, if you will, of Zionism, of what it is. Because in effect, Zionism is the civil rights movement of the Jewish people. But how often do we hear it couched and presented to an American youth in those terms? How often do we see, the struggle to create the State of Israel, the struggle to escape from persecution, presented in the same terms as the freedom marches in the South? How often do we attempt to recruit and understanding and sympathy in terms that American youth would understand, and European youth too? Well, we don't. So I think we have to reframe Zionism, its history. I think we have to reframe the presentation, rather, of it in new ways, and we have to put some of the best minds we have to start to think about that. And then the other thing is that we have a natural base of possible growth and support among those Jewish youth, especially today, who saw their classmates out marching on the campuses screaming, "Death to the Jews, death to Israel." They are not going to forget that experience. They were deeply impacted by that. Even kids who never went to Hillel and never heard about, Zionism are now deeply affected by it. We have to reach them. And I believe that the State of Israel has a central responsibility in coordinating that sort of effort with the Jews of Europe and with the Jews of South America and with the Jews of the United States. I think that we have to begin to re-envision, some kind of new movement coming out of Israel, hooking up with these other places, and begin to mobilize around that, and to do it in ways that is understandable and cool, if you will, to the young people. I think that the way Zionism is presented is so old hat and so tiresome that they don't even know what the anti-Semites are screaming about. A lot of probably young Jews don't even know what anti-Zionism means, because they don't even know what Zionism means. So that's my take on it. I think that we have to be very, very proactive. We have to draw Israel in closer, and Israel has to draw American Jewry in closer and European Jewry in closer, to focus hard on this. It can't be just about public relations, about the war. The war is over now until the next war. It has to be about focusing on this matter of what is Zionism and presenting that to youth globally, so that their backbones, as Ruthie said, can be strengthened, or was it Annika who said their backbones can be strengthened.
You've been listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, talk radio for fine minds, and a discussion is Anti-Zionism the New Anti-Semitism, with my guests, Alan Kaufman, Ruthie Blum, Joshua Muravchik, Annika Henroth-Rothstein, and Thane Rosenbaum. For more on each of my guests, please visit HalliCasser-Jayne.com. We'll post information on their upcoming appearances, their books, their websites, their Facebook and Twitter feeds. I wish we had more time. Come back. We'll do it again. Thanks, everyone. What a great, great job. Appreciate your honesty. Before I go, I want to remind everyone that podcasts of current and past shows are always available to listen to free on iTunes under the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show is also available for download via Spreaker.com, Stitcher.com, BlogTalkRadio.com, and a host of other venues. Google the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, and you will find us. Of course, podcasts of our shows, both past and present, are always posted for your listening pleasure at HalliCasser-Jayne.com, which I hope you'll visit often for the latest information on our upcoming segments. Oh, and while you're at HalliCasser-Jayne.com, don't forget to visit my blog to read my latest musings. I'll be back next week, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern, for another edition of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, Talk Radio for Fine Minds, brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download at www.audibletrial.com/The Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Audible.com features over 100,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Stay in touch, won't you? Remember, that's HalliCasser-Jayne.com. Discover us on Facebook at Halli Casser-Jayne and on Twitter at HalliCJ. I love to hear from you. So, till we meet again, this is Halli Casser-Jayne. It's a wrap.